Space did not care how many prayers were whispered into it. It swallowed fleets, empires, and whole civilizations with the same cold silence, and now it hung over the colony of St. Varros like an open grave waiting to be filled. Above the bruised gray curve of the planet, the last line of orbital defense was dying in pieces. From the surface, the battle looked like a slow-moving meteor storm. Burning wreckage rained across the upper atmosphere in molten streaks, each one the remains of a ship that had tried and failed to keep the enemy away from the world below. Defense stations that had guarded St. Varros for 2 generations were breaking apart one by one, their shattered rings tumbling through vacuum as hostile fire walked methodically across their hulls. On the command screens buried beneath the capital, the tactical display had become a massacre in red. The Allied frontier flotilla was gone. The escort carrier Resolute had vanished 13 minutes earlier in a bloom of plasma so large it had temporarily blinded half the colony's long-range optics. The destroyers Talon and Harrier had died buying time near the northern orbital lane. The old missile platform Bastion Actual had emptied its silos, jammed its firing rails, and then driven itself straight into an enemy cruiser at full burn when its captain realized there was nothing left to shoot. It had changed nothing. The invaders were still there. They came from the Dominion of Threx, a cold expansionist regime from beyond the Perseid fringe, a civilization that did not negotiate unless surrender had already been signed. For 6 months they had encircled St. Varros, strangled its trade routes, shattered its outer moonside depots, and burned every convoy that tried to break through the siege. Now they were finished pretending this was a campaign of annexation. This was extermination. In high orbit, the enemy dread carriers shifted into bombardment formation with mechanical precision. Vast spinal cannons rotated down toward the surface. Atmospheric penetration arrays unfolded along their undersides like the limbs of metal predators. Their formation spread wider, locking onto continental targets with the patient certainty of executioners preparing a blade. Across St. Varros, emergency sirens began to howl. In the lower districts of the capital arcology, families ran for deep shelters they knew were already overcrowded. Transit rails jammed with civilian traffic. Children cried beneath flickering red lights while citywide evacuation broadcasts repeated instructions no one believed would save them. In the agricultural belts farther south, workers abandoned hydro towers and cargo lifters and simply looked up at the sky, where the faint glimmer of orbital war reflected off a ceiling of black storm clouds. Everywhere the same realization spread like poison. No one was coming. For 3 weeks the colony had transmitted distress calls on every military, civilian and emergency frequency still functional. They had sent encoded bursts to Sector Command, wide beam pleas toward the inner worlds, blind typecasts toward patrol routes that might already be empty. Those signals had screamed into the dark until the relays overheated and backup systems had to be cannibalized just to keep the beacons alive. Nothing had answered. Not the Home Fleet. Not the Directorate Senate. Not even an automated acknowledgement buoy from the nearest trade spine. The silence had become its own verdict. Beneath the capital, inside Command Vault 9, the reinforced ferrocrete walls trembled as another impact shook the upper city. Dust whispered from the ceiling in pale streams. The lights flickered, dimmed, then steadied again on emergency power. Around the central holotable, exhausted officers stared at the tactical projection as if refusing to blink might somehow preserve the last few blue icons still alive on the board. There were not many left. One orbital minefield was still active over the Western Hemisphere, though enemy point defense had already chewed lanes through most of it. 2 ground-based anti-ship batteries remained operational, both running on redirected hospital grid power because the main reactor complex had taken a direct hit an hour ago. A handful of aerospace interceptors were trying to regroup above the equator, but their telemetry was unstable and their fuel reserves worse. St. Varros was not fighting to win anymore. St. Varros was fighting to delay the exact second it died. On the main screen, one of the colony's last defense monitors showed the outer exosphere in grainy magnification. The enemy flagship hung there like a black iron continent, surrounded by escorts and shielded by layers of rotating kinetic barriers. Along its ventral hull, massive bombardment apertures glowed with building heat. The first firing cycle was starting. Inside the bunker, nobody spoke for several seconds. Everyone understood what that meant. The first salvo would crack the planetary shield grid. The second would punch through the capital crust. The third would turn St. Varros into a warning visible from 3 systems away. A junior signals officer at the edge of the pit swallowed hard enough for the motion to show in his throat. His hands hovered over the console as if terrified to touch it. When he finally spoke, his voice came out thin and frayed. Final enemy alignment complete, he said. Bombardment solution confirmed. The words seemed to drain what little heat remained in the room. On the holotable, a new timer appeared beside the enemy formation. It flashed once in hostile crimson, then locked into a descending count. 259. No one breathed. 258. Somewhere above them, St. Varos groaned under the shadow of guns large enough to erase oceans. 257. And out in the indifferent dark, where all their unanswered distress calls had vanished, something began to move. Commander Elias Varon stood at the head of the holotable with both hands braced against its glowing edge, shoulders locked, spine rigid, as if posture alone could keep the world from collapsing around him. He had not slept in 31 hours. There were dark crescents under his eyes, soot smeared along the collar of his command coat, and a thin line of dried blood at his temple from when the bunker had bucked under the last near-surface impact. He had not noticed the cut. Or if he had decided it belonged to a later version of himself. A version that still existed after the timer reached zero. Right now there was only the table, the red icons, and the number falling in the corner of the display like an execution blade. 241. Shield grid status, he said. Major Liana Sato did not look up from her station. Her fingers were a blur across the cracked haptic surface, rerouting loads through systems that should have died an hour ago. Planetary envelope holding at 16% in the northern hemisphere. 9 in the south. We're bleeding power across every relay. If they fire a full-spectrum first volley, the grid folds. Can you patch the hospitals out and feed that reserve into defense? Sato hesitated for half a second. Yes, sir. Varon's jaw flexed once. Do it. No one in the bunker reacted. Nobody had the energy left for moral shock. Every choice had become arithmetic. Every decision was measured in bodies traded for minutes. At the sensor pit below him, Lieutenant Nico Dreven wiped shaking hands against his uniform pants before leaning toward his console again. He was young enough to still look startled by the shape of fear, as if some part of him had entered this war believing terror would eventually become familiar. It never did. It just found new faces. Enemy cruiser line is widening over the eastern arc, Dreven said. They're targeting infrastructure nodes now. Not just military coordinates. They want the survivors blind, murmured Sato. No, Varon said, staring at the tactical spread. They want them to watch. The bunker shuddered again. This time the tremor rolled through the vault in a long, low grind. A second later came the muffled thunder of something enormous hitting the upper districts. Overhead, dust rained down in thicker curtains. One of the side monitors flickered and died. Somewhere in the rear operations corridor, a woman cried out, and then the sound cut short as emergency bulkheads sealed automatically between sections. Varon did not turn. On the left side of the holotable, a secondary feed showed the civilian sectors and abstract heat signatures and casualty overlays. Sector Meridian was gone. The southern freight basin was gone. The eastern atmospheric scrubber towers were collapsing one by one, their structural skeletons toppling through smoke and fire. And at the center of the urban map, blinking weakly beneath a storm of static, was District Helios. Home. Not the command residence. He had not seen that place in months. Home was a fourth-floor apartment tucked above a transit spine lined with rain-stained cafes and old stone balconies imported at absurd cost from Earth because the first settlers had wanted the colony to feel cultured before it felt safe. It had a narrow kitchen, one perpetually leaking ceiling seam, and a window over the river channel where his daughter liked to sit on winter mornings and count shuttle lights. Mira had drawn stars on that window with washable chalk 3 days before the siege sealed the district. His wife had sent him the picture while he was still on the northern batteries. He still had it in his pocket terminal. He had not opened it since the bombardment began. Commander. Sato's voice softened despite herself. We just lost telemetry from District Helios. The room did not change. The lights still buzzed. The timer still fell. Consoles still spat streams of data no one could fully answer. But inside Elias Varon, something gave way with such total silence it was almost gentle. He looked at the sector display. Looked at the blank static where his family had last been. His wife, Mara, had refused evacuation to the deep military shelters. She had stayed in the civilian underlevels because the med stations were overwhelmed and she was one of the few trauma surgeons left in Helios. She had sent him a final message 22 minutes ago. Take care of the colony. We'll hold here. Come back when the sky is ours again. He had listened to it once. Only once. Because the second time would have broken something he still needed. 209. Sir? Dreven whispered. Varon realized the bunker was watching him. Not because he was their commander. Not only because of that. They were watching because every soul in the vault had something above them right now. A partner. A brother. Parents who had chosen the wrong district. Children buried beneath the same trembling city. They were waiting to see whether grief was still survivable in a room like this. Whether duty could still stand upright after the knife went in. Elias Varon inhaled slowly through his nose. When he spoke, his voice was level enough to sound almost calm. "Mark District Helios as unresponsive," he said. Sato's eyes glistened, but she nodded. "Yes, sir." "Reroute all remaining emergency bandwidth from civilian bands 3 through 7. Push it into tactical and targeting support." Dreven looked up in disbelief. "Sir, there could still be." "There are," Varon said quietly. "There are still people alive all over this planet. Which means we buy them every second we can." That ended it. No one argued again. The command vault settled into a harsher kind of silence, the kind born not from hope but from function. Officers leaned back into their stations. Damage readouts scrolled. Somewhere in the bunker, a generator coughed, caught, and kept running. Above them the world burned, and below it St. Varos did what human worlds had always done at the edge of extinction. It endured in pieces. On the main display the timer turned over again. 1:58. Varon straightened at the holotable and wiped the blood from his temple with the back of one hand. When he looked up, his expression had changed. The grief had not vanished. It had simply gone somewhere colder. "Open every surviving relay," he ordered. "Military, civilian, emergency, orbital debris bounces, mining channels, all of it. If anything out there is listening, I want our last signal to hit them hard enough to leave a dent in their soul." Sato turned toward him. "What do you want transmitted?" Elias Varon stared at the enemy flagship hanging above his world. "Tell them St. Varos is still alive." And in high orbit, as the bombardment fleet finished aligning its guns, an incoming transmission request flashed from the enemy command ship. The transmission request pulsed across every surviving screen in Command Vault 9 like a heartbeat from a corpse. For half a second no one moved. Then Lieutenant Dreven looked up from the signal pit, his face pale in the bunker glow. "Enemy command frequency," he said. "Priority override. They're forcing access through the old diplomatic bands." "Of course they are," Major Sato muttered. On the holotable, the hostile fleet continued to hold formation above St. Varos, an iron-red crescent wrapped around the planet's bleeding atmosphere. Bombardment cannons remained fixed on the surface. The timer kept falling. 1:46. Commander Elias Varon stared at the incoming request and felt something cold settle into place behind his ribs. This was not a negotiation. It was theater. One final humiliation before the blade came down. "Patch it through," he said. Sato turned sharply. "Sir." "Patch it through." Her mouth tightened. She gave a single nod and keyed the command. The tactical map vanished. For an instant the main screen dissolved into static, gray snow hissing over the bunker speakers. Then the interference cleared, and the bridge of the enemy flagship appeared in razor-sharp detail. It was obscene how calm it looked. The Threx command deck was vast and dimly lit, built in concentric tiers of polished black alloy and cold white tactical light. Officers moved with measured precision around recessed control pits, their armor immaculate, their posture relaxed. No alarms. No smoke. No flickering emergency strips. No sign that an entire world was dying beneath their guns. At the center of it all, elevated on a dark command dais, sat Strategos Malrek Thane. He looked less like a warlord than a man attending an opera. His armor was ceremonial charcoal over silver mesh, high-collared and mathematically precise, the edges lined with rank markings that caught the bridge light like thin knives. His skin had the pale, almost stone-toned stillness common among the Threx elite, and his eyes were an unnatural amber, steady and bright as if lit from within. One gloved hand rested on the arm of his command seat. In the other, he held a crystal drinking vessel half full of some dark liquid that reflected the burn of St. Varos in miniature. When he spoke, his voice entered the bunker like silk pulled over broken glass. "Commander Elias Varon," he said. "Still standing. I admit I find that admirable." No one in the vault answered. Malrek Thane glanced to one side as though reviewing a note on a private display. "St. Varos has exceeded our projected resistance duration by 11 days, 8 hours and 19 minutes. Your people have shown unusual stubbornness. It would almost be wasteful not to acknowledge it." Varon stepped closer to the pickup node built into the holotable. "You're very generous," he said. The Strategos smiled faintly, amused by the tone if not the words. "You misunderstand me. Generosity is for equals." This is record-keeping. Around the bunker, clenched jaws and white knuckles answered in silence. The enemy commander rose from his seat with unhurried grace and walked toward the bridge viewport behind him. Beyond the glass, St. Varos turned beneath the warfleet, scarred with fire. Even through the screen, the sight made the room feel smaller. Your world was offered terms at the beginning of this campaign, Thane said, still looking out at the planet. Surrender your orbital foundries. Yield your deep core refineries. Accept occupation and productivity quotas. In return, your civilian mortality estimate would have remained under 40%. He turned back. You chose resistance. His expression did not change at all. So now your extinction will educate others. In the signal pit, someone inhaled sharply. Varen felt the grief inside him shift, rising toward fury, but his voice stayed flat. If that was meant to frighten me, you've misread the room. Malrek took a slow sip from the crystal glass. No, Commander. Fear is useful only when there is a future left to bargain for. We are beyond that point. The strategos lifted one hand. At once, a secondary image bloomed beside him on the bridge display. Bombardment trajectories, atmospheric burn models, casualty predictions, impact spread across the continents below. The numbers rolled with machine certainty. Your northern shield grid will fail in the first wave, he said. Your capital crust will split in the second. By the third cycle, the oceans of your western hemisphere will begin to boil. Statistical survival after full strike saturation is functionally zero. He let the image hang there. Then he smiled again. I am offering you a courtesy, Elias Varen. A final transmission. In the bunker, Major Sato went very still. Transmit to your inner worlds, Thane continued. Tell them what became of St. Varos. Tell them what happens when frontier colonies mistake defiance for strength. Tell them the dominion of Threx is not a border dispute to be managed by committees and speeches. He stepped closer to the camera. Tell them the age of human expansion is over. Silence struck the bunker harder than any impact so far. Not because of the threat. Because of the arrogance. Because of the smooth certainty in his voice, the absolute conviction that St. Varos was already dead and merely had not fallen down yet. Elias Varen leaned both hands on the table and looked directly into the eyes of the being who had murdered his world from orbit. Behind his calm expression, he saw Helios District going dark. He saw Mara's last message. He saw Myra's chalk stars on the apartment window. He saw the enemy fleet hanging above them like a crown hammered from grave metal. When he spoke, there was no shout in it. No trembling. Just a hard human certainty sharpened to a blade. Here is my final transmission, Varen said. Go to hell. A few of the Threx officers on the far edges of the enemy bridge stiffened. One actually looked offended. But Strategos Malrek Thane only exhaled a soft laugh. I was born there, Commander, he said. That is why I know what survives the fire. He made a slight gesture with two fingers. The secondary display changed. This time it showed surface magnification of St. Varos's capital arcology. Targeting brackets settled over districts Elias knew by memory. Meridian. Helios. The river channel. The civic spires. The old stone quarter where settlers had built balconies from another world because they believed beauty could make a frontier permanent. The target locks pulsed one by one. In 79 seconds, Malrek said, this city ceases to have existed. In 93 your bunker follows. I suggest you spend the interval deciding whether you would like history to remember your courage or your futility. Sato's hand clenched so hard on her console that the cracked haptic glass bit into her palm. Blood welled along her fingers. Dreven whispered, Sir. But Varen never took his eyes off the screen. History, he said quietly, won't remember you at all. For the first time, the Strategos' expression cooled. Just a fraction. Just enough. Then the transmission cut. The tactical map snapped back into existence over the holodable in a flood of crimson symbols and descending vectors. The countdown in the corner resumed its merciless fall. 118. No one spoke for 2 full seconds. Then the bunker came alive. Enemy cannons charging past 90%. Thermal bloom across the flagship ventrals. Shield harmonics destabilizing in the north. Ground batteries requesting final fire authorization. Voices crashed together. Consoles flared. Somewhere in the rear chamber, a relay overloaded with a burst of sparks and the smell of burnt insulation. Major Sato was already moving, rerouting power between dying systems with one blood-slick hand while barking updates to backup crews deeper in the vault. Elias Varen straightened from the holodable. The grief was still there. The helpless rage was still there. But now it had shape. Authorize everything, he said. Sir? Everything. Every missile, every rail battery, every interceptor with enough fuel to light a funeral candle. I want their skies so full of fire they choke on it. Sato's answer came instantly. Yes, Commander. Driven looked up from his sensor feed, face ashen. It won't be enough. Varen's eyes remained fixed on the red enemy formation above St. Varos. I know, he said. On the display, the first bombardment signatures sharpened toward launch. And then, beneath the screaming load of hostile targeting data, a new reading flickered across the outer exosphere. Unknown origin. Impossible mass. Closing fast. At first, Lieutenant Nico Driven thought the new contact was a sensor ghost. That happens sometimes in battles this violent. Heat blooms, debris clouds, radiation wash from overloaded shields. Under enough strain, even hardened military arrays could hallucinate. But the reading on his screen did not behave like corrupted data. It was too consistent. Too heavy. Too fast. His breath caught. Commander, he said, voice cracking despite himself. I'm picking up a mass signature outside the primary engagement cone. Major Sato did not look up. Debris field? No. Secondary strike package? No, ma'am. Driven swallowed. It's bigger. Commander Elias Varen moved to the sensor pit in 3 fast steps. Show me. Driven expanded the outer exosphere map across his display. At the very edge of the tactical grid, beyond the hostile formation and just outside the planet's upper gravity shear, a single distorted marker pulsed in and out of existence. It did not have an IFF signature. No drive plume. No recognized slipstream profile. No transponder architecture at all. And yet it was there. More than there. It was forcing the surrounding data to bend around it. What am I looking at? Varen asked. Driven's fingers danced over the console, trying to stabilize the feed. I don't know, sir. Passive mass estimate keeps changing. 12 million tons. No 18. Wait. He frowned in sudden disbelief. That can't be right. Say it. 27 million tons and rising. Sato finally looked up from her station. That's not a ship. Another tremor rolled through the bunker, but this one felt wrong. The earlier impacts had come as blunt concussions from above, the unmistakable violence of artillery striking atmosphere and stone. This vibration was different. Lower. Longer. It passed through the deck plating like a buried growl, deep enough that teeth buzzed and the metal ribs of the command vault answered with a faint sympathetic hum. Several officers glanced up instinctively. No one said a word. On the holidable, the hostile bombardment vectors remained fixed on St. Varos. The Threx fleet was seconds from firing. Yet now a thin halo of static had begun to creep across the edges of the display, warping icons nearest the new contact. Electronic attack? Sato asked sharply. Driven shook his head. No known Dominion signature. Their jamming arrays are directional and broadband. This is localized. It's like the interference is being generated by space itself. Commander Varen stared at the sensor scatter. Can they see it? As if in answer, the enemy formation twitched. A cluster of Threx cruisers near the center of the bombardment line broke alignment and peeled outward. Targeting brackets on the main display flickered, blinked, then reacquired. A second later, more enemy ships began adjusting position. The perfect execution crescent above St. Varos started to deform. They see it, Driven whispered. They definitely see it. 103. The timer in the corner kept falling. The irony would have been laughable if anyone in the room still had the strength. 1 minute from annihilation, and now something impossible was materializing above the world like a new law of physics arriving late to the fight. A harsh burst of audio static cracked through the bunker speakers. Half the room flinched. Then came the sound. It did not enter through the communication grid in any normal way. It arrived through the walls, through the console frames, through the bolts holding the vault floor together. A rising metallic shriek, thin at first, then thickening into a layered howl that made every officer in the bunker stiffen as if cold water had been poured straight into their spines. Driven slapped both hands over one ear and stared at his screen in naked panic. It's not audio, sir. It's resonant bleed. Whatever that thing is, it's exciting structural metal all across the bunker. Another officer shouted from the back row, primary long-range optics are down. Compensate with LiDAR. LiDAR's blind. Then use gravimetric. It's worse on gravimetric. The holidable glitched. The red enemy icon stretched into smears for an instant, then snapped back. A heartbeat later, The entire display warped inward around the unknown contact as though some vast invisible hand had pressed a thumb into the projection from outside reality. Major Sato went pale. That's a gravity well. No, Dreven said, almost pleading with the console as fresh numbers streamed in. No, it can't be. A slipstream entry point that size would require staged harmonics, field anchors, pre-shearing. His voice broke off. It's opening too fast. Commander Varen looked down at him. How fast? Dreven turned, and the terror in his eyes silenced the room. Instantly. That one word seemed to change the temperature in the bunker. Every officer there had lived around military transit technology their entire adult lives. They knew what jumps looked like. They knew the math if not the engineering. Slipstream breaches were prepared. Measured. Stabilized over time. Nothing this large could simply appear without warning. Nothing sane could. On the main screen, one of the surviving orbital reconnaissance satellites finally reacquired the region beyond the Threx fleet. The image came in distorted and half-blinded by radiation haze, but it was enough. Space was tearing open. Not folding. Not warping. Tearing. A jagged wound of purple-black light split the void just beyond the enemy formation, its edges raw and uneven, venting coils of luminous particulate that twisted like blood in water. There was no smooth geometry to it, no disciplined symmetry of lawful transit. It looked violent, forced. Like some enormous object on the far side had stopped asking reality for permission and had begun ripping its way through with both hands. Someone in the bunker made a choking sound. The rift widened. Cherenkov glare washed across the satellite feed hard enough to bleach the image white for half a second. When it cleared, the wound was larger, deeper, and surrounded by distortions so severe that nearby stars had begun to bend into arcs. The Threx fleet panicked. There was no other word for it. Entire wings of bombardment destroyers broke formation and surged away from the anomaly. Capital ships fired maneuvering thrusters at dangerous angles, trying to scatter before the distortion reached them. Targeting locks on St. Varos dropped across half the hostile fleet as commanders abruptly prioritized survival over spectacle. Enemy formation collapsing, Sato said, stunned. They're abandoning firing alignment. On the screen, lances of Dominion weapons fire stabbed toward the rift. Plasma torpedoes, particle beams, rail slugs accelerated to obscene velocity, everything the enemy had closest to hand. The barrage vanished into the distortion without a trace. No detonation. No impact flash. The munitions simply ceased to exist, swallowed whole by the thing blooming open in front of them. Dreven's hands hovered uselessly above his console. Sir, he whispered, whatever's inside that breach isn't decelerating. Commander Varen felt every eye in the bunker shift toward the screen. The shriek in the walls rose another octave. The torn edges of the rift bulged outward. And through the purple wound in space, something black and enormous began to emerge. At first, the thing coming through the breach did not look like a ship. It looked like a blade. A single black wedge punched through the torn edges of the rift at impossible speed, dragging streamers of violet fire and shredded exotic matter behind it like a cloak made from the wreckage of physics. Its prow was brutally angular, built from overlapping slabs of armor so thick and dark they seemed to drink the satellite light rather than reflect it. No running beacons. No diplomatic strobes. No transponder flare. Just a scarred iron silhouette forcing its way into real space with the violent momentum of an execution. The recon feed shook so hard the image nearly collapsed again. In Command Vault 9, every officer stared upward in absolute silence. The vessel kept coming. It did not ease out of the dimensional wound the way sane ships did. It did not stabilize, orient, or bleed velocity. It came out like it had been fired from a gun, tearing across the outer exosphere on a course that intersected the heart of the Threx bombardment formation with terrifying, mathematical certainty. Oh my God, Major Sato breathed. Lieutenant Dreven's hands flew across his console. No transponder lock. No wait. He leaned forward so far his face was almost touching the screen. I'm getting a handshake response. It's old. So old the recognition architecture is barely parsing. Commander Varen did not look away from the feed. Talk. Dreven swallowed once hard. The code family is Directorate. Pre-federal restructuring. Possibly pre-senatorial reform. His voice faltered. That's not possible. Lieutenant. It's a military registry, sir. Black clearance. Buried in the dead archive layers. He stared at the characters resolving across the screen as though afraid saying them aloud would make them disappear. Vessel designation. He inhaled sharply. UES Revenant. The words seemed to strike the bunker physically. Sato turned so fast her chair slammed into the rear console. No. But Dreven was already digging deeper, ripping through authentication ghosts and museum-era encryption chains. Hull code confirms partial match. Legacy Heavy Dreadnought classification. Prototype series. Project designation. He blinked in disbelief. Project Nightfall. Commander Varen knew the name. Not from service records. Those had never mentioned anything like this. He knew it from the kind of stories that survived around old frontier garrisons after midnight, stories told by retired naval mechanics and drunk logistics officers who swore the Directorate used to build monsters before politicians learned how to rename fear into doctrine. Stories about ships too destructive to admit existed. About entire weapons programs sealed under moral review and erased from public memory. Ghost stories. Until now. On the main display, the UES Revenant fully cleared the rift. It was vast. The recon satellite tried and failed to frame it cleanly, forced to widen its lens again and again until the whole brutal shape came into view. The dreadnought was longer than a city sector and built with the kind of merciless industrial simplicity that only war ever perfected. Modern Directorate warships were sharp, elegant, efficient things designed by committees that wanted power to look civilized. The Revenant came from an older philosophy. It was ugly in the way fortresses were ugly. Purposeful. That's. Every line on its hull existed to survive, close, and kill. Its armor was matte black beneath layers of scorched ablative plating. Great scars ran the length of its flanks, some old enough to have oxidized beneath sealant repairs, others fresh and bright where re-entry friction had peeled whole sheets of outer coating away. Massive spinal apertures lined the bow. Heavy torpedo silos sat buried beneath armored shutters along the forward hull. And protruding from the ship's broadside, folded half-flush against the plating like the limbs of a sleeping predator, were banks of weapon housings no one in the bunker recognized. The dreadnought howled past a scattering Threx cruiser at such speed that the displaced gravity wake alone spun the enemy vessel sideways. Then the first shot came. No warning. No hail. No demand for surrender. The bow apertures of the Revenant flashed with a dull, hateful red, and a heartbeat later a line of fire erupted from its prow. Not beams. Not plasma. Solid projectiles, each one the size of a shuttle, hurled from magnetic launch channels at obscene fractions of relativistic speed. 3 slugs punched through the nearest Threx heavy cruiser before its shields fully rotated to meet the threat. The first cored the portside barrier. The second went through the reactor spine. The third simply continued on, ripping out the far side of the ship in a bloom of white metal, atmosphere, and broken gravity plating. The cruiser died so fast it barely had time to explode. One moment it was there, broad and arrogant in the old bombardment line. The next it was a cloud of incandescent wreckage expanding through vacuum. A sound escaped someone in the bunker, half laugh, half sob. Direct hit, Dreven whispered, though the phrase was absurdly too small for what they had just seen. The Revenant did not slow. It drove straight through the drifting remains of the cruiser, prow splitting the debris field, void shields flaring to life in a deep electric blue as molten fragments and nuclear fire hammered across its forward arc. The shield envelope looked strange, denser than any modern system. Not a clean bubble but a layered wall of compressed light that cracked and reformed in jagged planes around the ship's mass. On the enemy side of the battle, panic became contagion. Threx destroyers broke hard to starboard, trying to clear the dreadnought's path. Frigate screens surged inward to intercept. Point defense webs lit the dark in frantic latticework. Orders were screaming across every channel the bunker could still overhear, the Dominion command net suddenly stripped of all its earlier composure. The UES Revenant answered by opening its missile silos. Heavy armored shutters snapped back along the forward hull, and dozens of launch tubes vomited fire. Missiles erupted in a storm. Not sleek civilian defense interceptors, not the careful modular swarms of peacetime doctrine, but brutal military kill vehicles wrapped in heat-shrouding ablative coats and packed so dense with warhead mass they looked like small ships in their own right. They did not disperse in elegant formations. They lurched, rolled, split, and corrected with predatory ugliness, burning erratic vectors that overwhelmed Threx point defense tracking in seconds. The first wave hit a screen of enemy frigates. The second vanished into a carrier cluster. The third arced down through the center of the bombardment line and bloomed into overlapping spheres of nuclear violence that turned half the recon feed white. Inside Command Vault 9, alarms squealed as sensor saturation overloaded 3 stations at once. Consoles flashed hazard runes. One operator was thrown back by a power surge and had to be dragged upright by the tech beside him. But no one took their eyes from the main screen. Because through the radiation wash and exploding wreckage, the black dreadnought kept advancing. Not maneuvering around the enemy. Through them. Commander Elias Varen felt something ancient and feral stir in the center of his chest. Not hope. Hope was too soft a word for this. This was recognition. Some buried part of the human soul seeing a nightmare in the dark and realizing, with a shock that bordered on reverence, that the nightmare belonged to them. On the bridge of the enemy flagship, Strategos Maurek Thane reappeared in a snapped tactical inset, no longer poised, no longer amused. He was standing now, one hand braced against the command dais as data flooded the space around him. Even through the distortion of intercepted visual telemetry, the change in his expression was unmistakable. For the first time since the siege began, the architect of St. Varos's destruction looked uncertain. Enemy flagship is broadcasting priority tasking, Sato said, voice tight with disbelief. All nearby cruisers are reassigning fire to the unknown vessel. They've abandoned surface execution order. That sentence hit the bunker like oxygen. The countdown timer was still falling, but the bombardment lock indicators had begun blinking out across the enemy formation. One by one. Then three at a time. Then whole sectors of them. The guns pointed at St. Varos were turning away. Commander Varen stepped toward the holotable, eyes fixed on the impossible black shape cleaving into the Threx line. Can we hail them? Dreven almost laughed from raw nerves. Sir, I can barely identify them. Try anyway. He nodded and bent over the console. Outside, the Revenant reached the center of the enemy formation. For one suspended second it seemed to hang there, a steel mountain in the middle of a storm of weapons fire. Threx plasma batteries hammered across its shields. Rail impacts flashed against its armor. Lances of coherent particle light raked the hull from bow to stern. Enough firepower to gut a modern battle group converged on the ancient dreadnought at once. It kept coming. Then something unfolded along its port flank. The strange housing set into the broadside rotated outward with mechanical finality, revealing rows upon rows of recessed accelerator mouths buried behind armored iris shutters. Hundreds of them. Maybe more. The entire side of the ship was not armor. It was a gun deck. Major Sato stared at the feed, face drained of color. What in God's name? The answer came as a transmission. Not on the open channels first. Not on military command. It punched through every surviving frequency in the bunker at once. A low-band encrypted burst wrapped in authentication chains older than any active service code still in use. Consoles froze. Warning lights flickered. The room filled with a burst of static so dense it felt like the air itself had become charged. Then a voice, deep and roughened by age, came through the command speakers. St. Varos Control, this is the UES Revenant. The entire bunker stopped breathing. The voice continued, calm as iron. We heard your distress call. Commander Varen stepped to the pickup node, unable to keep the raw disbelief from his own voice now. Unknown dreadnought, identify command authority. There was the briefest pause. Then the reply came, carrying the cold weight of an older age. Captain Adrian Vale, Directorate Strategic Black Fleet, Nightfall Actual. Behind him, faint through the transmission, came the muted thunder of battle and the bark of hard military orders. Stand by, Commander. On the main screen, the Revenant rolled 90 degrees into the clustered heart of the Threx fleet. Its gun decks opened. And Captain Vale's final words hit the bunker like a promise delivered by a loaded weapon. We have the watch. The broadside of the UES Revenant fired. There was no elegant flash of energy, no clean sci-fi beam lancing across the dark. The ancient dreadnought answered the Threx fleet with violence so physical it seemed to drag the whole battlefield backward for a heartbeat. Hundreds of magnetic accelerator cannons detonated in perfect, brutal sequence along the port flank, each firing chamber vomiting a house-sized canister into vacuum with enough recoil to shove the Revenant sideways through its own shield bloom. Then the canisters burst. Not on impact. In transit. They split open halfway through the clustered Threx formation and transformed empty space into a slaughterhouse. Millions upon millions of hypervelocity tungsten flechettes, depleted uranium shards, and magnetically spun kill fragments screamed outward in widening cones. The effect was not an explosion. It was a wall of industrial murder. Point defense grids lit up too late. Interceptor lasers slashed through a handful of incoming debris, then vanished beneath the sheer density of the storm. Shield planes flashed across enemy hulls in brilliant geometric patterns, held for fractions of a second, and then collapsed as the mass barrage pounded through them with merciless momentum. One Threx cruiser lost its port side in a single instant. Another simply folded inward, its spine punched through so many times so quickly that the entire midsection crumpled like wet tin before the reactor went critical. Destroyers trying to evade were gutted from bow to stern, venting atmosphere and bodies in silent white plumes. Frigates shredded apart under the impact wave, their sleek hulls torn into spinning sections that collided with ships behind them and turned retreat lanes into chains of secondary detonations. Command Vault 9 vanished in the white flicker of overloaded recon optics. Someone shouted. Someone else laughed like a person standing at the edge of sanity and deciding not to step back. When the feed recovered, the center of the Threx formation was gone. Not damaged. Gone. Where a disciplined execution line had hung over St. Varos less than a minute earlier, there was now only a tumbling graveyard of broken armor, venting plasma, and burning debris drifting through expanding clouds of metallic dust. The black shape of the Revenant surged out of the wreckage halo with its shields blazing a furious electric blue, like some war god walking straight through its own thunder. Lieutenant Dreven stared at the screen, his mouth hanging open. They just gutted them. Commander Elias Varen did not answer. He could not. Because the ancient dreadnought was still not finished. Enemy flagship is rerouting all reserve batteries. Major Sato snapped, her voice rising over the bunker clamor. Full concentration on the Revenant. Every surviving capital ship is targeting it. On the main display, the Threx response came in a tidal wave. Particle lances, plasma spears, torpedo salvos, and rail fire converged on the Revenant from every surviving angle. The black dreadnought vanished behind a storm front of impact light. Its forward shields flared from blue to violet to a dangerous, blood-tinted red as layer after layer of punishment hammered into the ancient defensive envelope. Even its monstrous hull began to show wounds now, great burning rents through the outer armor, bright scars where kinetic penetrators had punched through plating and detonated inside. For the first time since it had arrived, the Revenant's advance slowed. In the bunker, hope tightened into fear again. "Sir," Dreven said hoarsely, "their shield envelope is destabilizing. No ship can take that much fire." Commander Varen's hands curled into fists at his sides. On the main screen, the Revenant's bow dipped slightly, adjusting its vector in the middle of the converging storm. Then the command channel crackled back to life. Captain Adrian Vale's voice came through the speakers calm as bedrock. "They clustered." That was all he said at first. Then, beneath his transmission, the bunker caught fragments of harder orders being thrown across the Revenant's bridge. "Divert secondary grid. Port battery reload complete. Spinal tracks hot. Helm, hold her steady. Let them close." Major Sato looked up sharply. "What are they doing?" As if in answer, two long armored seams along the Revenant's bow began to split apart. They opened slowly, deliberately, like the jaws of some prehistoric predator unhinging itself in the dark. Inside those recessed channels, buried along the entire forward spine of the dreadnought, magnetic rails glowed with building charge. Vast coils lit one after another in deep crimson pulses. The power draw was so enormous that half the surviving instruments in Command Vault 9 fluttered and dimmed just from riding the edge of the transmission echo. Dreven went white. "Those aren't standard spinal cannons." "No," Varen said, the word almost a whisper. The Threx flagship must have understood too late. Intercepted command chatter flooded the bunker in fractured bursts, suddenly stripped of all aristocratic composure. Collision alarms. Emergency turn commands. Orders to scatter, to break vector, to push the Leviathan-class flagship out of the dreadnought's firing lane. Too late. The Revenant fired. Twin slugs of condensed osmium and ferromantic composite screamed down the spinal rails and crossed the distance so fast the eye could barely follow them. There was only a flare at the bow, a line of warped darkness through vacuum, and then the Threx flagship lost both its engine clusters at once. Not exploded. Removed. The rounds punched through the rotating kinetic barriers as if they were smoke, sheared clean through the drive towers, and tore out the far side of the flagship in twin eruptions of molten armor and shattered reactor scaffolding. The massive vessel lurched violently, its elegant execution platform silhouette ruined in an instant, thrust vector collapsing into chaos. Whole sections of its stern peeled away and spun off incandescent into the void. The ship did not die. Captain Vale had chosen precision over obliteration. He had crippled it. In the bunker, every eye widened with the same stunned realization. "He left it alive," Sato breathed. Commander Varen's expression hardened. "He wants their commander." The tactical map confirmed it seconds later. The Threx flagship, once the cold center of St. Varos's execution, was drifting now, venting flame and atmosphere, its bombardment arrays dark, its mobility broken. Around it, the remnants of the fleet were falling apart. Some ships tried to flee. Others still fired in ragged panic at the Revenant, but there was no cohesion left, no clean command structure, no certainty. The Black Dreadnought had not merely broken their line. It had broken their confidence. Across a dozen intercepted channels, Dominion captains were shouting over one another, some demanding withdrawal, some screaming for cover, some still trying to restore firing order as their formation dissolved into a dead man's spasm. And over all of it came the old captain's voice again, transmitted wide this time, forced onto every surviving military band around St. Varos. Hostile flagship disabled, Vale said. All remaining enemy vessels are advised to cut drive and power down weapons. His tone never rose. It did not need to. You had your chance to leave this world alive. On the recon feed, the Revenant angled its prow toward the drifting Threx flagship and kept advancing through the burning grave of the fleet it had just annihilated. You missed it. For several long seconds after Captain Vale's warning rolled across the void, nothing happened. The surviving Threx ships hung scattered through the wreckage of their own dead, some still burning, some venting long white streamers of atmosphere, some drifting in stunned silence as if the crews inside could not yet accept that the battle had already ended. The black shape of the U.S. Revenant advanced through them without haste, its shield envelope cracked in bleeding sparks of blue static, its scarred hull still glowing in places where enemy fire had managed to bite deep. It looked less like a victorious warship than a blade pulled from a furnace. Then the first enemy destroyer powered down its guns. A moment later, another killed thrust. Then a cruiser vented drive plasma and went dark from bow to stern, surrender markers flashing weak and pale across its crippled hull. In Command Vault 9, every surviving officer watched the tactical display as one red icon after another dimmed, stabilized, or simply stopped fighting. Major Liana Sato pressed a blood-streaked hand to her headset. I'm reading hostile weapons shutdowns across sectors 2 through 5. Half their surviving line is surrendering. Lieutenant Dreven laughed once under his breath, an incredulous, broken sound. They're actually surrendering. Commander Elias Varen stared at the holodable and felt the truth settle through him slowly, carefully, as though his own mind feared jarring it loose. The guns above St. Varos were no longer pointed at the planet. The countdown to extinction had stopped. The world was still burning. The cities were still broken. Entire districts were gone forever and nothing could reverse the dead. But for the first time in 6 months and for the first time in the last terrible hour, St. Varos was not under sentence. It was still alive. A ragged cheer broke somewhere near the rear consoles. Then another. Then the whole bunker came apart. Not with discipline. Not with polished military dignity. With relief so violent it looked almost like grief. Officers who had not blinked through bombardment and casualty reports now sagged against their stations, laughing, swearing, crying openly. One signals tech covered her mouth with both hands and just shook where she stood. A wounded gunnery coordinator slumped down against the wall and buried his face in his arms. Somewhere in the pit, someone was thanking God. Somewhere else, someone was too exhausted to do anything except keep staring at the screen and breathe. Elias Varen did not join them. He remained at the head of the table, one hand pressed to its edge, eyes locked on the impossible dreadnought hanging above his world. Because victory had arrived in the shape of something old and terrifying, and men like him knew better than to mistake salvation for softness. Open a channel, he said. Dreven wiped his face quickly and nodded. To the Revenant? To Captain Vale. The lieutenant worked the board, hands still trembling. Channel open. Varen stepped toward the pickup node. He was aware of every eye in the bunker turning toward him again, but this time the silence behind him was different. No longer the silence of waiting to die. The silence of people listening for what came after. U.S. Revenant, he said, voice roughened by smoke, exhaustion, and something deeper he refused to name. This is Commander Elias Varen, St. Varos Colonial Defense Authority. There was a brief hiss of static. Then the old captain answered. Go ahead, Commander. Varen looked up at the screen where the black dreadnought hovered amid the dead. We transmitted distress calls for 3 weeks, he said. No fleet acknowledged. No relief package launched. No one answered. He paused once, steadying himself. I don't know who you are, Captain. I don't know where in God's dark you came from. But you just saved this world. The pause on the line this time was longer. When Vale spoke again, his voice had changed only by a fraction. Still iron. Still hard. But something under it had shifted, some older weight pressing through. We heard your distress call, he said. That was enough. In the bunker, even the breathing seemed to stop. Varen swallowed against the pressure in his throat. St. Varos is heavily damaged. Orbital defense is shattered. Surface casualty counts are still coming in. We have infrastructure collapse across 3 continents and no guarantee the remaining enemy ships won't regroup. They won't, Vale said. It was not bravado. It was simply fact. Then the captain continued, voice carrying across the bunker speakers like a hand laid flat against old human law. Stand down your remaining interceptors, Commander. Mark all surviving defense grids allied blue. We have the watch. Something in Elias Varen gave way then. Not visibly. Not enough for the room to see. But enough that his grip on the table loosened and the steel behind his ribs finally cracked around the edges. He bowed his head once, a soldier's acknowledgement to another soldier, and let the words out despite the burn in his chest. Understood, Captain. The channel remained open another second. Then Vale added, prepare a shuttle team. I want you aboard my ship within the hour. His tone hardened again. Bring your chief tactical officer. Bring intelligence if you have any left. And bring questions. The line clicked dead. Major Sato looked at Varen. You think he knows who ordered this? Varen's gaze moved to the drifting ruin of the Threx flagship. Oh yes, he said quietly. I think he intends to ask. The shuttle ride to the Revenant felt unreal. St. Varos turned beneath them like a wounded animal, its night side slashed with fire, its atmosphere stained brown and crimson by bombardment residue. From above, the capital was a broken crown of smoke and ruptured light. Whole districts had gone dark forever. Others flickered weakly as emergency grids fought to hold. Search beams were already beginning to crawl through the ruins, tiny and stubborn against devastation vast enough to be mistaken for geography. Beside Elias Varen, Major Sato sat strapped into the troop bay in full field harness, face set into that professional stillness soldiers used when they were too tired to afford emotion. Across from them, 2 Marines from the vault detail held magnetic carbines across their knees and stared openly at the silhouette waiting ahead. The UES Revenant eclipsed the stars. Up close, it was even worse than the long-range feeds had suggested. Larger. Crueler. The hull was a landscape of layered armor and exposed weapon architecture, patched battle scars crossing its flanks like old burns. There were no decorative lines, no softened contours, nothing civilian anywhere in its design. This ship had been conceived by people who believed survival was purchased in tonnage, recoil, and fear. Their shuttle clamped to a forward auxiliary lock beneath the ship's portside batteries. When the hatch cycled open, they were not greeted by honor guards or polished officers. They were met by 6 heavily armed Marines in matte black pressure armor with hard-edged helmets and physical slug rifles big enough to belong in another century. No glowing plasma coils. No sleek smart shell loaders. Just brutal steel weapons held by men who looked as old and scarred as the ship around them. The lead Marine stepped forward. His voice came through the helmet grill like gravel under tank treads. Commander Varen. Major Sato. Captain Vale is waiting. He turned without ceremony. This way. The interior of the Revenant was a cathedral built by people who hated comfort. Harsh white strip lights. Exposed structural ribs. Steel deck plates worn shiny by generations of boots. The air carried oil, ozone, old machine heat, and the metallic aftertaste of fresh battle damage. Damage control teams moved through side corridors with practiced urgency, sealing ruptures, welding over scored bulkheads, stepping around the dead without slowing down. No one gawked at the visitors. No one spoke unless necessary. The ship felt less crude than inhabited by function itself. They were led down 2 decks, through a blast corridor still scorched black from internal overpressure, and into a secure detention compartment. Captain Adrian Vale stood outside the central holding cell with his hands clasped behind his back. In the bunker transmission he had sounded old. In person he looked like age had been hammered into shape by war and then sharpened. He was broad-shouldered, hard-faced, his dark hair gone mostly iron-gray at the temples, deep scars cutting one side of his jaw and disappearing beneath the collar of a plain black command coat with no decorative insignia beyond a single tarnished directorate crest. His eyes were pale, tired, and utterly awake. He regarded Elias Varen for one steady moment, then extended a hand. Commander. Varen took it. The captain's grip was dry, heavy, and calloused like forged metal. Captain, Varen said. St. Varos owes you more than I can put into words. Vale's expression did not change. Then don't waste breath trying. He turned his head slightly toward the cell behind the glass. Use it on him. Inside the holding chamber sat Strategos Malrek Thane. The elegant conqueror of an hour ago was gone. His ceremonial armor had been cut away in places to treat burns and impact trauma. One arm was locked in a restraint brace. Dried blood marked the corner of his mouth. But the worst damage was in his eyes. Not pain. Not defeat. Fear. Not of death. Something else. Vale keyed open the inner barrier. Malrek looked up as they entered, and for the first time since Elias Varen had seen him on the screen above St. Varos, the Threx commander's composure cracked completely. "You idiot," Malrek whispered, staring not at Varen but at Vale. "You should have let us finish." Major Sato went still beside the door. Varen took one step forward. "You burned my world." Malrek's laugh came out ragged and hollow. "Your world." He shook his head slowly, eyes wide with something close to disbelief. "This was never about your world." Captain Vale's voice dropped half a degree. "Talk carefully." The Threx stratego swallowed. When he spoke again, the words came faster, pressed out by urgency instead of pride. "We were not here to conquer St. Varos," he said. "We were here to silence it." The compartment seemed to contract around the sentence. Varen's jaw tightened. "Explain." Malrek looked between the three humans as if measuring whether any of them were capable of understanding the scale of what had already begun. Then he said the words that took the victory they had just bled for and turned it into something colder. "You think we came to kill a colony?" he said. "We came to stop a signal." Outside the holding cell, somewhere deep in the black iron body of the Revenant, warning klaxons began to sound. The klaxons did not sound like battle alarms. Battle alarms were sharp, immediate things meant to trigger motion. These were deeper, slower, almost mournful, their pulse rolling through the Revenant's armored decks in measured intervals that felt less like a warning and more like an announcement from a machine that had been dreading this exact moment for a very long time. Captain Adrian Vale did not flinch. He turned from the cell and touched two fingers to the comm node built into the collar of his coat. "Bridge." A voice answered at once through the compartment speaker, tight but disciplined. "Captain, we've got a long-range passive spike from beyond the outer debris field. It hit us 30 seconds ago, but the radiation wash from the battle masked the first return. We're confirming now." Vale's eyes narrowed. "Pattern." There was a brief pause. Then the bridge officer answered in a tone stripped clean of all remaining comfort. "Non-Threx. Non-human. Ancient architecture. Matching partials from dormant archive threat models." Major Liana Sato looked at Elias Varen. Neither of them needed to say it. Malrek Thane sagged back in the restraint chair and let out something between a laugh and a sob. "There," he whispered. "There it is." Varen rounded on him. "What signal?" The Threx strategos licked blood from a cracked lip and stared at the humans as if they had just torn the roof off their shelter in the middle of a storm. "Subspace noise," he said. "Transit signatures. Military burn patterns. Industrial relay chatter. Shield harmonics. Reactor wash. Your colonies have been growing louder for decades. Ours too." His eyes shifted toward Vale. But St. Varos was different. Captain Vale said nothing. Malrek saw the recognition in his silence and gave a trembling nod. "You know exactly what I mean." Commander Elias Varen felt the cold begin in his spine. "Say it plainly," he ordered. The strategos looked at him with sudden, ugly pity. "Your colony sits on an abandoned relay spine buried under the mantle," he said. "Precursor infrastructure. Not human. Not Threx. Something older. Our deep surveys found it when we first came to this sector. Most of it was dead." He swallowed. "Most of it." Major Sato stepped forward. "And the part that wasn't?" Malrek's face tightened. "It was listening." Silence hit the compartment like a pressure wave. The slow pulse of the klaxons rolled through the walls again. Captain Vale turned to the speaker. "Bridge. Put Tactical Chamber 1 live. Route everything there." "Aye, Captain." He looked once at Varen and Sato. "You wanted answers. Come get them." The chamber they entered was not a modern briefing room. It was older than that, harsher. A circular compartment of black steel and recessed projectors with no wasted ornament anywhere in its construction. Thick armored shutters had already sealed over the viewports. The central hololith was awake when they arrived, filling the room with a cold blue projection of St. Varos and the surrounding system. Around the table stood half a dozen Revenant officers in plain black duty coats, all of them carrying the same weathered, hard-used look as their captain. No one made introductions until Vale entered. Then each of them straightened just enough to acknowledge command. The hologram shifted. St. Varos rotated slowly above the table, and beneath the planet, layered in ghostly wire frame beneath the crust and mantle, something immense began to resolve. It was not natural. Even in schematic, the structure looked wrong. A web of angular conduits and concentric chambers buried thousands of kilometers below the surface, stretching from the core-adjacent pressure zones all the way up toward ancient fracture lines in the northern hemisphere. Vast relay spines. Amplification nodes. Signal chambers the size of cities. Most of it was dark. One section was not. A single buried array glowed in hostile amber beneath the shattered remains of the northern continental shelf. Major Sato stared. "That's under us." "It is," Vale said. One of his officers, a lean woman with cropped white hair and a scar across one temple, touched her console and brought up overlapping telemetry. The bombardment fractured the mantle around the buried relay lattice. When the Threx opened fire, they didn't just hit the colony. They hit the array. "We believe the energy surge woke a surviving transmission organ." "Transmission to who?" Varen asked, though a part of him already knew. The officer answered with a thin, humorless calm. "To anything that still obeys the old network." Captain Vale rested both hands on the edge of the table. 43 years ago, before the Directorate buried my ship and everyone like it, Strategic Black Fleet found evidence of machine-cleansed systems in the Perseid Dark. Dead worlds. Scoured habitats. Fleets reduced to drifting metal sand. No biological remains. No occupation. He looked up at Elias Varen. Only extermination. The blue light of the hololith carved his face into deeper lines. "We traced fragments of the pattern to dormant relay structures like the one under St. Varos. Not one civilization built them. Many used them. They were signal roads, Commander. Ancient subspace infrastructure from a network older than any living species in this quadrant." His jaw tightened. And every time a relay screamed loud enough, something came to answer. Malrek Thane gave a weak, bitter laugh from where two Revenant Marines held him near the sealed hatch. "We called them the Silence Engines." "No," said Vale. "That was your name for what you feared. We had another." Varen looked at him. The captain's eyes did not leave the glowing amber knot beneath St. Varos. "Harvesters." The room seemed to lose heat. One of the Revenant officers expanded the outer system map. Beyond the debris field of the recent battle, beyond even the far orbital lane where St. Varos's last warning buoys had died, new contacts were appearing. Not many. Not yet. 3 at first. Then 8. Then 12. Each one a faint green-black distortion riding in from deep space without visible drive plume or conventional transit wake. "They don't travel like ships," the officer said. "They fold local geometry and ride the pressure gradient. Passive until close. Then they wake fast." "How fast?" Sato asked. The officer looked at her. "Fast enough that the Threx decided genocide was the rational option." Varen turned sharply toward Malrek. "So you slaughtered civilians to hide a relay signature?" Malrek's face twisted, but whether from shame or anger it was impossible to tell. "We tried quieter methods first. Jamming. Mantle drilling. Core disruption. The relay kept building charge. St. Varos kept transmitting. Every shuttle launch, every defense burn, every distress beacon made it worse." He shook his head. Once the signal crossed threshold, there were only two paths left. Silence the world, or let the harvest begin. Captain Vale's expression hardened into something carved from old war. "You chose the easier evil and called it strategy." Malrek snapped back with sudden desperation. "And what would you have chosen?" Vale did not answer immediately. He studied the new contacts blooming in the dark around St. Varos, the dead fleet wreckage, the wounded world below, the ancient amber signal still pulsing beneath the crust like a buried heart too angry to die. Then he spoke, and every word landed like a weapon set carefully on the table. "I would have chosen what comes next." He touched the hololith. The system map collapsed outward, racing past St. Varos, past the local debris shell, past the frontier lanes, until it halted over a distant region of ion storms and stellar ash marked by a dead Directorate code in crimson. A black site. A shipyard. An old wound on the edge of charted space. Major Sato's breath caught. "What is that?" Vale looked at Varen. "That," he said, "is where we buried the rest of the monsters." And beyond the outer dark of St. Varos, the first of the approaching contacts unfolded like a predatory machine opening its limbs. The chamber went silent except for the steady pulse of the klaxons and the low mechanical growl of the Revenant's wounded reactors fighting to keep pace with everything the ship had just survived. On the hololith, the distant black site marker burned in cold crimson at the edge of charted space, half buried inside a region of ionized stellar ruin where no sane trade route would ever pass. Around St. Varos, the first of the newly arrived contacts continued to unfold in the dark, each one resolving into angular, predatory geometry that made even the Threx warships look almost civilized by comparison. Commander Elias Varen stared at the growing threat icons and forced himself to stay still. "How long?" he asked. One of Vale's tactical officers answered immediately. "At their current velocity and vector, first contact with the inner debris shell in 47 minutes. Weapons engagement inside low orbit inside 90, depending on whether they accelerate once they acquire denser targets." "Can St. Varos survive 90 minutes? Nobody answered him. They did not need to. The colony's orbital defense was ruined. Surface grids were limping on emergency reserves. Aerospace wings had been gutted. Even if every surviving gun on the planet was dragged upright and pointed skyward, St. Varos could not fight another fleet tonight. Not against something that had frightened the Threx into planetary murder. Major Liana Sato broke the silence first. "Then we evacuate what we can and run." Captain Adrian Vale looked at her. "Run where?" She glanced at the map, jaw tight. "Anywhere that isn't sitting on top of a screaming ancient relay." "And leave the relay active?" Vale asked. "Leave the harvesters a beacon bright enough to guide more of them in?" He shook his head once. "No. If St. Varos falls dark without the relay being cut out at the source, they will still come. This colony is already marked." At the hatch, Strategos Malrek Thane gave a weak nod, his face gray beneath the chamber lights. "He's right. Once the signal crosses recognition threshold, suppression only buys time. You don't hide from the network. You sever it or you burn everything around it." Commander Varen turned on him with quiet hatred. "You've done enough talking." Malrek met his stare and for the first time, did not answer with arrogance. "Only exhaustion." "Not yet." Vale ignored them both and touched the hololith again. The map shifted from St. Varos to the distant black site. Layers of interference peeled away. Radiation storms. Ion wakes. Gravitic debris. Then the ghost image of something enormous emerged inside the crimson-marked nebular scar. At first Varen thought he was looking at an asteroid cluster. Then the geometry resolved. Docking pylons the size of cities. Defensive rings built into shattered rock. Shielding spires hidden inside plasma clouds. And at the heart of it all, tethered in immense silent rows behind blast veils and armored gantries, hung warships. Dozens. Then more as the perspective widened. Hundreds. Some were shaped like the revenant, brutal wedges of black armor and spinal weapon mass. Others were even larger, slab-sided siege platforms and heavy dreadnoughts with pronged emitter arrays mounted along their flanks like the limbs of giant iron predators. Smaller but still monstrous escort cruisers clung to outer moorings. Missile barges. Electronic warfare hulls. Dock defense satellites. Autonomous kill platforms resting cold in the dark like sleeping mines with engines. Major Sato forgot herself and whispered, "Dear God." Captain Vale's voice stayed level. Project Nightfall was not a ship. It was a doctrine. His eyes remained on the ghost fleet. The Directorate commissioned a contingency force built for wars no senator would publicly admit might come. Extinction wars. Machine wars. Civilizational resets. His mouth hardened. Then peacetime returned, the committees came out, and people decided weapons this brutal were more offensive to them than the abyss beyond the frontier. One of the Revenant officers keyed another layer into the projection. Crew manifests flickered red across almost every hull. Empty. Mothballed. Awaiting activation. Commander Varen looked up sharply. "They're intact. 40 years in blackout stasis," Vale said. "Fully fueled. Armed. Maintained by automated yard intelligences and sealed machine crews. Waiting for a command authority no one intended to wake." Malrek laughed weakly from the doorway, the sound raw and unbelieving. "You're serious?" Vale finally turned toward him. Painfully. The Threx Strategos stared at the armada in the hologram, and for the first time since Varen had met him, his fear was no longer abstract. It had found something larger than his own plans to fear. "If that fleet is real," he said, "then your directorate buried the one thing in this quadrant that might actually hurt them." Captain Vale's expression became almost contemptuous. "Yes." Silence returned. This time it was not despair. It was scale. Varen could feel everyone in the room doing the same ugly arithmetic at once. The harvesters were incoming. St. Varos was broken. The buried relay still screamed beneath the colony crust. And somewhere beyond the edge of ordinary human traffic waited a fleet powerful enough to alter the shape of the next war before it even properly began. The problem was time. Major Sato found it first. "Even if we leave now, we don't have enough ships to crew all of that." "We don't need all of it," Vale said. Not yet. He magnified the shipyard again. Several highlighted hulls pulsed gold in the projection. 4 heavy dreadnoughts. 9 cruisers. 6 carrier arsenal hybrids. A ring of defense satellites and autonomous missile fortresses. First wave activation package, he said. Ships with the lowest cold start time and the highest strategic return per crew body. Enough to build a wall around St. Varos while we do the harder work below. Varen frowned. Below. Vale touched St. Varos on the map and dragged the glowing amber relay node out from beneath the crust. This signal ends, he said. One way or another. Major Sato folded her arms. You're talking about a core-adjacent assault into an alien transmission structure beneath a collapsing planet. I am. That's not an operation. That's suicide with logistics. Captain Vale looked at her, and for the first time something like approval touched his face. Good. That means you understand the scale. Commander Varen stared at the relay projection, then at the highlighted warships in the distant black site, then back to the approaching green-black contacts outside St. Varos. In another life, before 6 months of siege and 1 hour of apocalypse, he might have demanded permission from Sector Command, or requested confirmation, or spent precious time trying to build a cleaner answer. But St. Varos had already burned through all clean answers. How many crews do you need for first wave activation? He asked. One of the Revenant officers answered. For full operational readiness across the highlighted package? Minimum 18,000 trained personnel. Gunners, engineers, command crews, damage control, flight support, reactor technicians, tactical. Varen nodded once. We have them. Major Sato looked at him. Elias. We do, he said harder now. Not in parade condition. Not rested. Not whole. But the deep bunkers still hold thousands of orbital defense personnel, Navy Reserve crews, drop-shock Marines, mechanics, combat engineers, every half-broken bastard on St. Varos who survived because they know how to fight and keep machines alive. He looked back to Vale. And right now they're sitting on a dead world waiting for the next wave to finish the job. The old captain watched him for a long second. Then he gave a single, slow nod. I was hoping you'd say that. Malrek Thane gripped the restraint rail on his chair. You can't possibly mean to arm those ships and go hunting. Vale's eyes cut toward him like sharpened ice. No. The Threx strategos blinked. Then the captain stepped to the table and drove one fist down beside the glowing relay beneath St. Varos. We arm those ships, Vale said, and we go to war. The chamber seemed to tighten around the words. Commander Varen felt something shift inside him then, something that had begun back in the bunker when the Revenant came screaming through the rift and had only been waiting for shape. Not hope. Not relief. Purpose. St. Varos had been reduced to rubble and mass graves. His wife and daughter were almost certainly gone. The world he had sworn to defend would never again resemble the colony he remembered. But if there was still a choice left in the universe, then it was no longer between living and dying. It was between dying hunted and dying with teeth in the dark. Major Sato exhaled once, long and unsteady, then straightened her shoulders. If we're doing this, we need every shuttle that still flies, every surviving cargo frame, and full emergency impressment protocols from the bunker network. You'll have them, Varen said. One of the Revenant officers was already moving to a comm station. I can wake the Black Site Yard intelligences and begin pre-spin on the selected hulls. Do it, Vale said. Another officer asked, and the harvesters approaching St. Varos? The captain touched the nearest green-black contact on the map. Its projected silhouette unfolded wider, like an insect opening metal limbs beneath the sea. We buy time, he said. Same way our kind always has. Commander Varen looked at him. By bleeding? Captain Vale's mouth became a thin, humorless line. No, Commander, he said. By teaching the dark that it picked the wrong species. And across St. Varos, emergency channels that had spent weeks carrying screams and final prayers began transmitting something new. Mobilization orders. Mobilization on a dying world did not look heroic. It looked like floodlights cutting through smoke over shattered launch fields. It looked like stretcher crews stepping around the dead to drag ammunition crates into half-collapsed shuttle bays. It looked like bunker gates cranking open beneath a poisoned dawn while thousands of exhausted soldiers, pilots, engineers, and mechanics marched out in ash-streaked armor toward a sky that still burned with falling wreckage. Across St. Varos, every surviving military frequency began speaking the same language. Report. Arm board. There were no speeches. There was no time. Commander Elias Varon stood on the Revenant's auxiliary command deck and watched the first wave rise from the surface in long files of patched dropships and cargo lifters. Some still wore colony defense markings. Some were civilian hulls with improvised armor welded over cracked plating. A few were captured Threx shuttles stripped of insignia and crammed with human marines riding on bare deck plates beside crates of missiles and reactor components. Above them all, the black bulk of the Revenant turned slowly in orbit, scarred broadside batteries tracking outward toward the deep dark where the harvesters were closing. Surface embarkation count? Varon asked. Major Liana Sato did not look up from the tactical rail. 12,000 aboard outbound lifts. Another 5 en route to launch sectors. Bunker Command just confirmed they've stripped every remaining reserve unit that can still stand upright. Captain Adrian Vale stood with his hands behind his back, pale eyes fixed on the outer approach vectors. Good. Not enough, Sato muttered. No, Vale said. But enough to begin. On the main display, the first harvester contacts were crossing the wreck line of the dead Threx fleet. Now that the radiation wash had thinned, their shapes were easier to read and easier to hate. They were not elegant machines. They were predatory geometry given motion, obsidian black frames built from intersecting planes and knife-like limbs, their surfaces threaded with sickly green circuitry that pulsed in time with no signal human ears could hear. They did not use engines. Local space bent around them as they moved, warping light and gravity alike, gliding through debris fields without the slightest correction burn. Range? Vale asked. One of his officers answered from the pit below. First cluster will enter weapons envelope in 8 minutes. Commander Varon looked back toward the planet beneath them. St. Varos rotated slowly through the viewport, wounded beyond repair, cities broken, atmosphere stained brown and red by bombardment ash. Somewhere beneath that ravaged crust, the buried relay was still screaming into the dark. Somewhere under those same broken skies, civilians huddled in bunkers waiting to learn whether salvation had arrived too late to matter. He thought of Helios District, of a chalk star on a window, of a message he would never answer. Then he pushed all of it down into the same cold place that had carried him this far. Tell the surface lifts to maintain schedule, he said. No delays for incoming fire. Sato looked at him once and nodded. The first battle against the harvesters began at extreme range. The Revenant fired before the machines crossed half the outer debris shell, her spinal rails vomiting twin lines of relativistic iron into the dark. One harvester vanished in a burst of fractured geometry, its black carapace shattered apart by brute force trauma no adaptive field could fully absorb. A second reeled, half its body sheared away, still trying to move even as green light bled from its ruptured frame. The others did not slow. They answered with silence and dark energy. Green-black lances ripped across vacuum and struck the remnants of a drifting Threx cruiser between the Revenant and the incoming swarm. The crippled warship did not explode. Its hull came apart at the atomic level, dissolving into a glittering gray cloud that spread outward like a handful of ash blown across a grave. Lieutenant Nico Dreven, back at a sensor console after refusing medical leave twice, stared at the feed with bloodless lips. Shield bypass confirmed. Captain Vale's expression did not move. I assumed as much. Then how do we stop them? A younger officer asked. Vale looked at the tactical spread. The old-fashioned way. The Revenant rolled to port. Broadside gun decks opened. This time the discharge came as a layered storm. Shrapnel canisters, nuclear torpedoes, dense kill missiles, all launched in overlapping patterns designed not for elegance but for saturation. Space between the dreadnought and the incoming harvesters became a corridor of human aggression so dense it looked like a second asteroid belt forming in real time. The leading machines vanished into it and came out broken. One lost 2 of its bladed limbs and spun end over end into a cloud of dead Threx wreckage. Another took 3 nuclear hits across its central lattice and split apart in a bloom of green static and boiling obsidian fragments. But for every one destroyed, more shapes moved behind it. The harvesters were not a fleet. They were a tide. Captain, Sato said, voice tight, if more of them are following the relay track. I know. Vale touched a command rune. Calm. The ship-wide channel opened instantly. All across the Revenant, thousands of St. Varos survivors and ancient Blackfleet crew heard the captain's voice. Listen carefully, he said. This is not a holding action. This is a door. We hold it shut long enough for our people to reach Nightfall Yard and wake the fleet. We hold it shut long enough for strike teams to cut the throat of the relay under St. Varos. We hold it shut because if we fail here, every world inward of this colony will hear the same knock in the dark. He paused only a second. Hold your stations. No cheer answered him. The ship did not need one. The Revenant fought like an old beast that had waited too many decades for the universe to justify its existence again. She drove forward into the harvesters instead of backing away from them. Her broadside tore open machine constructs by the dozen. Her missile salvos blossomed into nuclear suns across the outer lanes. When dark energy beams cut through her shields and scored molten wounds along her hull, she answered by ramming one crippled harvester outright, prow shattering its core and sending both bodies tumbling through the dead Threx debris field in a flare of blue shield fire and green machine blood. Below that battle, the mobilization continued. Shuttles climbed. Cargo lifters climbed. Improvised troop carriers clawed their way out of the atmosphere on overloaded engines while the Revenant and the last surviving surface batteries bought them minute after minute with steel and reactor fire. Then Nightfall Yard woke. The first sign was not visual. It was a signal. A cold encrypted burst came flooding back across the old Blackfleet channels, so dense with authentication chains and command handshakes that half the auxiliary displays on the Revenant flashed white trying to parse it. Dreven looked up so fast he nearly tore his headset free. Captain. I see it. On the holodable, the crimson marker around the distant black site vanished. In its place, one by one, gold icons began igniting across the nebular scar. First 1. Then 4. Then 12. Then more. Ancient reactors coming online. Dock clamps releasing. Automated defense platforms arming. A buried fleet pulling breath into its lungs for the first time in 40 years. Major Sato exhaled something like disbelief. They're actually moving. Captain Vale watched the icons multiply and gave the smallest nod. Patch the yardmaster. A new voice entered the bridge, distorted by distance and machine routing. It sounded almost inhuman in its precision. Nightfall Yard acknowledges strategic black authority. First wave activation at 27%. Cruise inbound. Combat systems green across selected hulls. Awaiting operational doctrine. Commander Varen stepped forward before anyone else could speak. This is Commander Elias Varen, St. Varos Colonial Defense. Doctrine follows. He looked at the widening holotable, at St. Varos, at the incoming harvesters, at the awakening gold icons in the far dark. Defend this colony. Cover relay assault teams. Kill anything that answers the signal. There was a half-second of silence. Then the Yardmaster replied, Doctrine accepted. As if the universe had been waiting for those words, the tactical board changed again. Beneath St. Varos's crust, strike team markers began descending toward the buried relay through ancient mantle shafts opened by bombardment fractures and old mining bores. In the outer system, the first activated Nightfall cruisers tore free of their moorings and angled toward emergency slip insertion. Around the Revenant, the harvesters kept coming, silent and relentless, their green-black bodies unfolding wider as more of them slid into the system from the dark beyond. The war had not been stopped. It had only just been named. Captain Vale turned from the tactical spread and looked at Elias Varen. Your world is still marked, he said. The relay dies tonight if the teams can reach it. But even if they do, these things won't stop with St. Varos. Not now. Varen knew that. He could see it in the tactical board. In the number of contacts. In the way the harvesters had come not as raiders or scouts but as a process finally triggered into motion. How many more? He asked. Vale's eyes returned to the stars beyond the viewport. In the network? He gave a grim, humorless smile. Enough. The deck shuddered as another dark energy beam scraped across the Revenant's flank. Damage alarms flashed. Somewhere aft, a compartment vented atmosphere and men with welding rigs and magnetic boots ran toward the breach because that was what humans did when the dark bit chunks out of their ships. They ran toward it and started fixing things with burned hands. Major Sato straightened from her station. First Nightfall jump signatures forming, Captain. Gold icons began to vanish from the distant black site marker. Not dying. Jumping. Ancient black warships entering transit on collision courses with a battlefield over St. Varos. Captain Vale drew a slow breath, then keyed the ship-wide and fleet-wide channels both. Across the Revenant, across the outbound shuttles, across the newly waking warships of Nightfall Yard, across every surviving human band still carrying breath and current, his voice spread like iron poured into a mold. St. Varos still stands, he said. The enemy in front of us is not a border power, not a siege fleet, not something that can be bribed, delayed, or reasoned with. It is extinction with engines. It has fed on silence and fear for longer than our species has known how to crawl. He looked out at the incoming harvesters and the first answering jump flashes of his awakening fleet. It came here because someone screamed into the dark and expected nothing to answer. The first Nightfall cruiser tore into the system in a rupture of brutal black light. Then another. Then 3 more. Monstrous human warships, old as buried sins, sliding into battle around the Revenant with guns already hot. Captain Vale's voice hardened until it sounded like the law of a harsher universe. Well, it answered wrong. The bridge of the Revenant filled with the cold golden bloom of Allied icons returning to the board. Commander Elias Varon stared at them, and for the first time since St. Varos began to die, he felt something stronger than grief. Not hope. Hunger. Below them, strike teams drove deeper toward the buried relay. Around them, the first line of awakened Blackfleet warships opened fire. Beyond them, more Harvester contacts were still rising out of the dark. The true war had arrived. And humanity, bloodied and half-buried, was rising to meet it with monsters of its own.